Good evening, everyone. Whoever's here is here. Welcome back for this summer's Apollo Music Festival. You can chat amongst yourselves. We're really excited to be back. I'm Valerie, the viola player, and I'm just going to share some thoughts about tonight's program. We're going to start this year off with the Sonata Number 1 in B flat major for 2 violins by the early classical composer Joseph Boulogne. Boulogne was born in 1745 in Guadeloupe, which is a French-controlled island in the Caribbean, or was at that time. His father was a plantation owner who had come there from France, and his mother was a slave who had been born in Senegal and brought over to Guadeloupe. We don't know a lot about his early musical training, other than by the time he was 8, he was living in France, and he was attending an elite school for both the arts and athletics, while his father worked for King Louis XV as his personal assistant. I can't imagine what that job would be like. This connection to royalty also resulted in Joseph receiving his knighthood and his official title that some of you may know as the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. Boulogne made a living as a musician and was extremely well known in the musical circles of the 1770s. He made his debut as a violin soloist and conductor in the 1770s, and that debut actually outshone his younger colleague, the much more famous Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, at least amongst the audiences in Paris. Mozart really admired Boulogne as a composer, and there is some evidence that he copied some of Joseph's music as a compositional learning exercise as he kind of worked out how music goes. So I wondered if these two prodigies ever met, and the internet told me that they did. Boulogne and Mozart did indeed cross paths for sure in the year 1778, while they were both in Paris for Mozart was in Paris for a 3-month visit, and Boulogne was living there. They lived just across a courtyard from each other. They had friends in common, but it's too bad that's about all we know. There's no documentation to give us more info about their interactions there. Were they friends? Were they rivals? Were they indifferent to each other? All that we know is that they really admired each other as musicians. So later, Boulogne's orchestra would be considered the most accomplished in Paris and rivaled many of the big orchestras across Europe. He took up the helm at a second orchestra in the 1780s. This one was sponsored and frequented by his very close friend, the Queen Marie Antoinette, and there's some letters that show that they would play music a lot together. He would write little pieces for her to play, and they would switch off playing violin and piano. And it was also with this orchestra that Joseph Haydn premiered his 6 Paris symphonies in 1786 with Joseph on the podium. And he was receiving pretty much universal praise across Europe for his musical talents, both as a performer and a composer. And across the Atlantic, our president, John Adams, acknowledged him as the most accomplished man in Europe in riding, shooting, fencing, dancing, and music. So, as President Adams referenced, Joseph was an expert fencer, and he would headline matches all across the continent and was known to have only lost 1 match in his entire life. That was also part of his being knighted, so it was important. Joseph composed in the late Baroque, early classical style, and his collection of works includes 14 violin concertos, 2 symphonies, some string quartets, some songs, and shorter chamber music pieces like the Sonata for 2 violins this evening, which is part of a group of 6. In these sonatas, you'll hear right away that the parts are not equal, like you might be used to hearing in other chamber music, especially when there are only 2 players. We've done a lot of duos here, and you're used to things kind of going back and forth. This will not happen. The first violin will carry all of the melodic material, and the second violin will accompany that. So due to the simplicity of these pieces, some musicologists think that they were maybe written earlier in Joseph's compositional learning, maybe even before he was considering himself a professional composer. They were put out into the world later, but like I said, a lot of people think maybe this was him kind of trying things out. But even so, they're very charming, elegant, nice way to start start this year, and I'll share a little bit more about him next week because we're hearing a second of these sonatas for two violins next week. So after that, we're going to move on to the G major sonata for violin and piano by Johannes Brahms, which was written in 1878 to 79. The work of Brahms, as we know, is central to German Romanticism. His great friend Robert Schumann instantly found Brahms to be a genius at combining the classical style that we're coming out of with Boulogne and the romantic form and character that we know him to have mastered. Brahms composed this G major sonata shortly after the very untimely death of his 24-year-old godson, the violinist and poet Felix Schumann, who was one of the 8 children of Robert and Clara. And though we do hear some of that grief there, the larger mood of the piece is much more tender. And Clara actually wrote him a letter. They exchanged many letters, as we know, saying, when she first heard the piece, I could not help bursting into tears of joy over it. And I wish the last movement could accompany me to the next world, which is a very powerful compliment. Clara's tears of joy may have come at the expense of Johannes's tears of frustration, as this sonata is likely his 3rd, 4th, or even 5th attempt at writing a sonata for this combination. It had been over 27 years since he had written a very short scherzo for 2 friends. Another thing that put pressure on writing these violin sonatas was his relationship with his friend, the great Hungarian violinist, Joseph Joachim, for whom Brahms also wrote his violin concerto just prior to this. And this sonata was an apology to try to end the kind of years of bitterness between he and Joachim after Brahms sided with Joachim's wife following their divorce. So all that stuff gets in there with friends. But despite these personal issues in their relationship, Joachim never wavered in his support and his frequent performance of Brahms's music. Brahms was obsessively secretive about his compositional process, and unfinished works of his would never be released unless he deemed them of the highest quality. Anything he didn't like, he would burn. So we don't know as much about his compositional process as we do about some other composers. So if there's anything that even resembled a full violin sonata that predates this, it's lost, and we don't know kind of what he struggled with in those other 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 attempts. This sonata is a 3-movement work, and it references an earlier Brahms song that describes the rain. Perfect for today. In kind of both childlike and more passionate ways. So Rachel and Garrett are playing this tonight, and Rachel shared that she programmed this piece first for she and Garrett to play in her hometown of Bellingham, Washington, because it rains so much there. So she's like, let's play the rain piece. But the day they played it, it was like and some of the poem on which Brahms set the song, and then the sonata, so I'll read it to you. Cascade rain, cascade down, wake for me those dreams again that I dreamed in childhood, when water foamed on the sand. When oppressive summer heat contended idly with cool freshness, and shiny leaves dripped with dew, and crops turned a darker blue. How blissful then it was to stand with naked feet in the flow, or to brush against the grass, or grasp the foam in both hands, or to catch the cold drops on my glowing cheeks, and to bear my boyish breast to fresh awakened scents. Like the dripping chalices, my breathing soul stood open, like the flowers drunk with fragrance, drowned in heaven's dew. Each shuddering drop seeped through and cooled my beating heart, and creation's secret weaving penetrated our secret lives. Cascade rain, cascade down. Wake me in those old songs that we sang in the doorway when the drops resounded outside. I'd love again to listen to their sweet, moist murmuring and softly bedew my soul with innocent, childlike awe. So we don't need to know this to invest in and appreciate the sonata, but it does give us some insight into Brahms's literary influences and his state of mind at the time of writing this. He was living a very peaceful life himself in the Corinthian countryside, and I think we hear that kind of relaxed, pastoral natural quality throughout the whole sonata. The final piece tonight is the second piano quintet of French composer Gabriel Faure. It was his final four-movement work. Faure is widely regarded as the master of the French song, but after the songs and his famed Requiem, his chamber works make up the bulk of his most important contributions to Western music, and he contributed to chamber music in many ways. He has a violin and a cello sonata, piano trios, piano quartets, string quartet, and two piano quintets. There are also some really beautifully organized and elegant orchestra pieces. One of my favorite pieces in all of orchestra music is his setting of Pelléas and Melisande. Short, not as big as the Debussy opera, so check it out. Faure was born in 1845, and his young musical education began around age 9 when he was sent to Paris, like Boulogne, to study and become a church organist and choir master. And fellow composer Camille Saint-Saëns took a great interest in Faure's progress, and a lifelong friendship came from those studies. Public recognition came to Faure kind of late in life, and for nearly all of his life, he was obliged to work as a in the trenches musician, just as he had been sent to do as an organist, a choir master, and a composition teacher. During his professional life, he developed a really close relationship with the famed organist Charles-Marie Widor. I'm blanking on the name. I'm looking at the Gustafsons. The Widor Toccata, right? Famous. And they were organists at the same church, and they would play little improvisation games with each other, where somebody would make up a little something, and then as soon as the other person got accustomed to it, then somebody would change the key. And if somebody did that to me, I would walk out. I couldn't absolutely not cope with that. But I think it's really very charming. So this busy work schedule left Faure only summer holidays for composition and performances in salon concerts where he could try out new pieces. And by the 1870s, his pieces were being premiered primarily at the newly formed National Society of Music, which also featured music by his friend Saint-Saëns, Bizet, Franck, Chabrier, and other French young composers. Faure composed this quintet pretty under the radar between 1919 and 1921, only telling his wife that he was working on it. Despite this secrecy, by his last years, Faure was recognized in France as absolutely the leading composer of the day. And as he was writing this quintet, he received the Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor, which is a merit-based civil honor that was started by Napoleon. But musicians were very rare recipients of this award, so it was a pretty big deal. Usually you received it for some sort of military or civil service. And this piece was received extremely well by audience members and critics alike. Faure dedicated this piece to fellow composer Paul Dukas. If you know nothing else of Dukas, you know his most performed work, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which was later used in Disney's Fantasia. It's the one where Mickey has too many brooms and too many buckets. And it is also for Dukas that he wrote a version for piano duo that came out in the following year. It is definitely a work filled with mystery and some nods to Faure's mortality that we often hear in later works of many composers as they look towards the ending of their lives. For Faure, his death would come just 3 years later. It's also good to keep in mind, we played both quintets here now. The first piano quintet was written 16 years earlier, so he's experienced a lot more life since returning to this particular combination. The one difference is that the second quintet only took him a few months to write, whereas the first quintet took him 18 years. So then if we count those 18 years too, it's really been, he's in a totally different part of his life by the time he's doing this piece. So bringing together kind of youthful qualities and mortality may initially seem incompatible, but it's definitely not for Faure in this piece. We hear kind of some youthfulness, fresh, generous quality to the music, very tender. And then we also hear the wise, older Faure with very kind of clean, balanced music. He was having a period of kind of renewed creativity because right around the time when he was working on this, he retired from being director of the Paris Conservatory a post that he had held since 1905. By this point in his life, Faure was struggling with a pretty unique hearing challenge as well, where he heard high sounds a third lower than they actually were and low sounds a third higher, which seems kind of unmanageably disorienting. I don't know how you would, I mean, yeah. I thought that he just lost his hearing, but when I read more into this particular disorder, for a musician especially, that is very disorienting. So from the opening bars of the quintet's first movement, we hear a very kind of shimmering motor in the piano, and that will stay with us for the entire piece. The viola starts, and each of the string voices kind of add their life force. It's very vibrant, even though sometimes the tonal center seems to veer away sometimes. But the middle section is a little more defined, and then the end is quite celebratory, the first movement. The second movement is a scherzo. It's just chromatic and bouncy and feels very scurrying because of the chromaticism. And then this is kind of paired with very long lyrical lines, but that piano motor is still there all the time. He plays a lot of little rhythmic games, and then it ends with a series, what he would take as like a joke in the piano part, where it sounds like Garrett's playing a lot of wrong notes, but it's not. So Garrett would never play wrong notes. The more mysterious third movement feels a lot like a late Beethoven quartet or some very early Wagner. And I would never say that Faure was influenced by Wagner in his own compositions, but he was a huge admirer of Wagner's music. So I'm wondering if maybe just a smidgen of that harmony we're hearing it in this very late piece in Faure's life. I read that he saw the complete ring cycle in Munich and London, and then he also saw Meistersinger and Parsifal at Wagner's operatic home in Bayreuth. That's good commitment, especially in the early 1900s. He had to travel. The third movement is just kind of a continuous stream of music filled with really passionate heights, kind of dreamy moments as well. And so here again, we're seeing Faure play with these kind of opposite states of being, both youthful and kind of looking at mortality. And the opening of the final movement kind of recalls the first movement, with us entering one after each other with Garrett's motor underneath. And this opens the door to kind of a stream of very exuberant, soaring music in the last movement, but still does hold on to some of that wistfulness. And much like the first movement, the piece ends very triumphant, C major, happy, yes. So those are my thoughts on tonight's program. Thank you for coming a little bit early, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.